Did you see what she just dropped? The manager's voice cracked through the dining room, and the whole place seemed to stop breathing as a gold ring skidded across the tile and came to rest by Claire Hart's shoe. Ethan Reed stepped in front of her before the chef could point again. One hand lifted, the other already reaching for the ring through a folded napkin so no one could claim it had been touched. The man near the hostess stand kept his phone raised, filming with a hungry little smile. Under the white lights, Claire looked cornered, her face pale and her hands still wet from the sink. She didn't take it? Ethan said, calm but iron hard, while the manager adjusted his tie and said, call it in, and keep the girl where she is. I only wiped the tray, Claire whispered, staring at the floor like she was afraid even the air would accuse her. 3 hours earlier, the restaurant still smelled like garlic, hot oil, and bleach, and Ethan had been carrying plates through the dinner rush with the tired patience of a man who had learned how to move quietly through hard days. The aprons were damp with steam, the glass doors kept fogging at the edges, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a sound that got under the skin after too long. Claire had been in the back corner by the sink, sleeves pushed up, hair tied tight, rinsing silverware in silence while the younger servers rushed past her as if she were part of the machinery. Ethan had noticed the ring before anyone else noticed the panic. It had been lying on a folded linen near the prep table, half hidden in the shadow of a tray stand, bright for 1 second and then gone the next, as if someone had wanted it seen only long enough to cause trouble. The manager, already polished and smiling for the guests, moved in fast. No one leaves, he said, his voice smooth enough to pass for concern. We do this the right way. But his eyes were too sharp, too certain, and Ethan caught the smallest thing that did not fit. The camera above the sink had a dark little gap in its red light, as if it had blinked out at exactly the wrong moment. Claire stood very still, looking smaller than the white apron she wore, and Ethan could see the panic in the way her fingers kept folding and unfolding at her side. He didn't ask her to defend herself. He just set his plate tray down, walked to the sink, and asked the busboy to stop touching anything. Then he took the ring again, slow and careful, and turned it under the light. The gold band flashed once, and inside the curve, hidden from the room, was a tiny engraved crest that did not belong to any cheap diner trinket. Something formal and old, something private enough to make Claire's throat tighten the moment she saw it. For the first time, she looked directly at the ring instead of away from it, and Ethan saw her expression change, just slightly, as if the object in his hand had reached into a place in her memory that she had never meant to open. The manager noticed that change too, and for one brief second his smile slipped. For a second, nobody in the restaurant moved. The ring sat inside Ethan Reed's folded napkin like a small, accusing moon, and the manager's smile tightened just enough to show teeth. Mr. Reed, he said, still polite, still smooth. You'll return to the floor now and let the supervisors handle this. Ethan didn't argue. Claire stays out of the sink area until we know what happened, the chef added, glancing at her like she was a stain that might spread. Claire lowered her eyes, and the silence around her felt worse than a shout. A server passing by muttered, not quietly enough, "Of course it was the waiter who made a scene." Another voice answered, softer, "People like that always think they saw something." Ethan heard it all, the way a man hears rain beginning through a thin roof. He set the napkin down on the nearest stainless steel counter, not because he was done, but because he knew the room was waiting for him to lose his temper so they could call that proof. "Show me the camera," he said. "Not later. Now." The manager kept his hands folded in front of him, the picture of professional concern. "We're not doing this in front of guests," he said. "We are a full house, and you are creating confusion." His voice was almost kind, which made it worse. He turned toward the tables with a practiced little nod, as if Ethan were a chair that had been moved out of place. "The staff will continue service." That was the first humiliation. Not being accused, but being made invisible while accused. Ethan felt the heat from the kitchen vent on one cheek and the cold from the dining room door on the other. The room smelled like butter, bleach, fried onions, and the metallic sting of overworked silverware. He could see his reflection in the polished prep table. White shirt, black apron, sleeves rolled, shoes scuffed at the toes, the kind of man people trusted with plates but not with truth. The manager's assistant stepped closer to the sink, not touching Ethan, just enough to show control. "We'll need a statement," she said, eyes on the ring instead of on Claire. But after the rush, Ethan looked at the camera over the sink again. The little red light was still dead. That dark circle above the faucet now seemed to swallow the whole story. Claire stood at the edge of the prep line, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Nobody asked her name. Nobody asked what she had seen. They only asked how fast she could get back to work. Ethan heard the chef speak in the practiced tone of a man protecting a brand. "A missing item in a dining room is a liability issue," he said. "We need discretion." Discretion. That was the second humiliation. Turning someone's fear into a public relations problem. Ethan took a breath, slow and low, and when he spoke again, he kept his voice level. "Then pull the footage before it disappears." The manager's eyelids lowered a fraction. Not anger. Something more careful. Something calculating. "Are you suggesting someone altered our system?" "I'm saying the camera above the sink went dark at the exact time that ring vanished." Ethan pointed once, not dramatically, just enough for the gesture to land. The chef gave a short, polite laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You wash dishes for a living, Mr. Reed. You don't read systems." It was said softly, but the room heard it anyway. A couple of servers looked down. One guest at the bar lifted his glass and pretended not to listen. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer the insult with one of his own. He simply stepped to Claire's side and asked, just as quietly, "Did anyone tell you to touch that tray after the ring was noticed?" She shook her head once. No, the answer was small, but it landed like a nail. The manager's assistant looked back and forth between them, then quickly at the chef, and that tiny hesitation told Ethan more than her words. The ring still lay under the napkin on the counter, its engraved crest catching the light each time someone passed. He had seen rich people's jewelry before, expensive enough to feel fake, but this wasn't that. It looked old, private, family-guarded, and Claire had stared at it like she'd seen a ghost. Ethan reached for the folded napkin again, but the manager's hand came down flat on the counter first, blocking him without actually touching him. "We'll secure all items," he said. "You will step back." His tone stayed courteous, but there was a tiny edge now, a note that said the conversation was ending whether Truth agreed or not. Claire swallowed. "I didn't." "Claire?" The manager cut in gently, with that fake kindness that bruised more than yelling. "Nobody is blaming you. We're only trying to sort out what happened." Ethan looked at the way the woman beside him shrank at the sound of her own name, and he understood that this was how the house worked. Not with open cruelty, but with polished hands and clean words. He could feel the room narrowing around her, around the ring, around the dead red camera light above the sink. Then the chef leaned in and said something that almost passed for reassurance, except his eyes flicked to the prep table, to the invoice clipboard, and back to Ethan with too much speed, as if he had just remembered a detail he wanted hidden. Ethan caught that little flicker. The manager caught Ethan catching it. And for the first time, the man in charge stopped smiling. The manager's smile had gone thin, but Ethan Reed didn't match it with anger. He simply reached for the clean apron hanging on the hook by the steam shelf, shook it open once, and draped it over Claire Hart's shoulders the way a man covers a person standing too long in a cold wind. It was a small thing, almost nothing in a room full of polished shoes and expensive voices, but Claire's breathing changed the moment the fabric settled around her. "Sit for a minute," Ethan said, low enough that only she could hear. He set a paper cup of water beside her, then turned back to the counter before the manager could turn his kindness into weakness. The ring still lay under the folded napkin, and Ethan did not let anyone touch it. Not because he thought he had power here, but because he knew how fast truth could vanish when too many clean hands reached for it at once. The chef let out a quiet, dismissive breath. "He's treating this like a rescue mission," he said, smiling at no one in particular. "It's a dish pit, Reed, not a courthouse." Ethan heard the insult, but he did not answer it. He only unfolded the napkin one edge at a time and checked the inside of the band again. The little engraved crest was still there, and now, under the prep light, he noticed something else. A faint line of blue ink caught in the groove, like the ring had brushed against a file folder, an invoice, or the corner of a sealed envelope. That tiny detail sat in his mind heavier than it should have. He slipped the ring back into the napkin, then into the inside pocket of his apron, not as theft, but as protection from a man who had already tried to turn the room into a story he controlled. At the same time, the old worry that never really left him pressed up from beneath his ribs. The apartment rent was due in 6 days. Mia's school had sent home a note about lunch money again. He had promised her a simple dinner and a calm bedtime, not another night of coming home with that hollow look in his eyes. His wife used to say he carried other people's weight like it belonged to him. She had been gone long enough that the habit still felt like a bruise he learned to live around. So he set the bruise aside, looked at Claire, and did the next right thing. He asked the youngest busser to bring another dry towel, then moved one step between Claire and the dining room, not blocking her like a guard, but shielding her from the staring guests who had already started to decide who she was. A man at the bar muttered that people who work the sinks always have something to hide. Ethan heard it. He also heard the manager answer with a soft, reassuring, almost fatherly tone. No one is accusing anybody yet. That was the worst kind of cruelty in the room, because it wore manners like a clean shirt. Ethan reached across the prep table, picked up the invoice clipboard the chef had left half open, and saw the timestamp on the top sheet. It matched the exact minute the camera had gone dark. He did not announce it. He simply turned the clipboard so he could read the signature again, and the name at the bottom made his jaw tighten by 1 degree. The manager had signed the maintenance request himself. The screen above the sink had not failed by accident. Claire looked up when Ethan's expression changed, and there was just enough fear in her eyes to tell him she already knew someone here had done more than forget a receipt. She knew this place had rules, and some of those rules were meant to keep her silent. Ethan folded the invoice once and tucked it beside the ring in his apron pocket. Then he pulled a fresh stack of paper towels from the dispenser and set them near Claire without making a scene, as if order itself could still be restored one careful motion at a time. "Keep your hands dry," he told her. "That's all for now." She nodded, and that nod carried more trust than he deserved from a stranger. Across the room, the manager watched the exchange with the kind of patient contempt that men use when they think decency is a phase. He assumed Ethan was wasting time, protecting the wrong person, making trouble out of a small stain. But Ethan had already seen the real stain. The off-camera, the ink in the ring, the manager's too-fast signature. The way Claire recoiled from anyone who said her name too loudly. And as he stood there with the hum of the fluorescent lights above him and the smell of bleach and onion grease hanging in the air, he realized the kindness he had just offered was not only for her. It was the first thing in the room that had not been arranged to lie, and the invoice in his pocket had begun to point toward a truth the manager had already tried to hide. The manager did not raise his voice. He did something worse. He smiled at Ethan Reed like a man granting permission to a child, then said, "Mr. Reed, if you keep inserting yourself into this matter, you'll force us to document your interference." The words slid through the room with polished ease, and suddenly the kindness Ethan had just shown Claire Hart was being recast as a problem. Claire was told to step back from the counter and wait near the service door, where the light was dimmer and the floor smelled faintly of mop water and old grease. Ethan could feel the room turning against him in small, careful ways. A server not meeting his eyes, a guest at the bar lowering his phone, the chef going strangely still. No one accused him directly, but the shape of the accusation was there. He had become the man who made a scene. He had become the waiter who would not stay in his place. "I only asked for the camera," he said. "And I only asked for calm," the manager replied, still soft, still professional, as though calm belonged to him by title. Then he reached for the napkin in Ethan's apron pocket without asking. Ethan did not let him take it. He only moved one step back, and that small motion made the manager's eyes narrow for the first time. The little red light above the sink was still dead, But now it was not alone in looking wrong. Ethan had set the maintenance invoice from Part 3 on the prep table, and the overhead lamp caught the numbers just enough to show that the camera had been marked as service 10 minutes before the ring fell, which should have been impossible if the log had been honest. The time stamp on the receipt sat crooked in a way his eye could not ignore. He held it up between two fingers and asked, very quietly, "Why does this say the camera was checked after the line was already full?" The kitchen sound seemed to thin out around that question. Somewhere a tray clinked against a rack. Somewhere else, a fryer hissed and popped as if the room itself were nervous. The manager did not answer immediately. He looked at the receipt, then at the dead camera, then back at Ethan with a careful, measured expression that tried to become patience. "Paperwork lags," he said. "That's all." But the explanation came too fast, and Claire, standing near the service door with Ethan's spare apron still around her shoulders, flinched at the word paperwork as if it had a history. She kept her eyes on the floor, yet her hand drifted, almost unconsciously, toward the pocket of her own apron. Ethan saw the movement and noticed the old phone half hidden inside the fabric, its cracked screen dark but not dead. It had not been there before. Or if it had, no one had mentioned it. He did not reach for it. He only said, "Whose phone is that?" Claire's lips parted, but the manager answered before she could. "Lost property," he said. "We hold items until the end of shift." The tone was impeccable. The meaning was not. Ethan looked at the phone again, and the angle of the cracked glass caught the light just enough for him to see a sliver of a notification icon near the top. A missed call. A number he did not recognize. The manager stepped sideways, too casually, and blocked the view with his shoulder. That was the first real clue he could feel in the room, not just see. A dead camera, a crooked timestamp, and a phone being hidden like it mattered. "Move," Ethan said, still not raising his voice. The manager's smile stayed in place, but his eyes sharpened. "You need to understand boundaries." He said it like a man protecting order, like a man disappointed in someone who had forgotten his manners. Then he glanced at Claire, and in that glance Ethan caught something small and ugly. Not confusion, but recognition. He knew her better than he was admitting. Not enough to reveal himself, only enough to fear what might happen if the wrong object was seen under the wrong light. Ethan did not miss that. He took the invoice again and turned it so the fluorescent strip ran across the signature. The name at the bottom was not just the manager's. The last stroke curved the wrong direction, as if the hand had been rushed or copied from memory. "That's not your usual hand," Ethan said. It was a simple sentence, almost bland. Yet the room changed around it. The manager's assistant blinked once. The chef turned his head. Claire lifted her eyes a fraction, as if hearing a door unlatch somewhere far away. The manager laughed softly, but it was a brittle sound, thin as paper. "Now you're comparing handwriting?" "I'm comparing facts," Ethan said. He placed the receipt beside the ring, then held both under the same light. The ring's engraved crest glinted, and the ink caught inside the groove like a trapped thread of blue. Claire's gaze locked on that blue trace, and for the first time her breathing quickened, not from fear alone but from memory. She whispered, "That's from the file room." The words were barely there, but they landed hard. The manager's expression changed in an instant, just a flicker, yet Ethan saw it. Claire had said something she was not supposed to know. He recovered quickly, of course. "You're upset," he said to her, the voice now almost paternal. "You're confused. It's been a long night." He took one step toward the service door as if to guide her away from the room, and in the same motion his hand reached for the old phone in her pocket. Too fast. Too specific. Ethan caught the movement and the reason behind it at the same time. This was not about a missing ring anymore. It was about what the phone might contain. A buzz sounded then, sudden and faint, from somewhere in Claire's apron pocket. The cracked old phone had come alive with a call from an unknown number, the screen flashing once under the kitchen light before the manager's hand froze in midair. For one silent second, nobody in the room knew who had just called. But Ethan saw the manager's face lose its polished calm, and that was enough to tell him the first clue had not only appeared. It had begun to point somewhere he had not yet seen. The old phone buzzed again in Claire Hart's apron pocket. A short, insistent vibration that cut through the kitchen noise like a warning nobody else could hear. The manager's eyes snapped to it at once. "That should be turned over to office property," he said, his voice still smooth, still kind on the surface, as if he were offering a favor instead of reaching for control. Claire's hand tightened around the phone, and Ethan Reed noticed the tiny tremor in her fingers before she could hide it. "Let me see the screen," Ethan said. "Not the phone. The screen." That small difference mattered. The manager gave a soft laugh that sounded almost amused. "We're not doing a fishing expedition in the middle of dinner service." Then, with a gesture polite enough to pass for courtesy, he added, "Let's keep this contained. No one wants the room to misunderstand." But the room had already begun to misunderstand him less and Ethan more. A server at the pass slowed with a basket of rolls in her hand. The AC vent above the prep line clicked once, louder than it should have in the silence that followed. Claire took one breath, then another, and Ethan heard something in that breathing. Not just fear, but the strain of someone trying to remember what she was allowed to keep. "I'm not asking for a scene," Ethan said. "I'm asking for the original." The manager's smile held, but his jaw tightened by a fraction. He glanced toward the dead camera over the sink, then back to Ethan. "The original what?" "The footage," Ethan said. "And the maintenance record. The one you signed yourself." For the first time, the assistant beside the manager stopped moving. Her hand, which had been reaching for a stack of menus, froze halfway to the wood. The manager's face didn't break, but Ethan saw the little delay before he answered. "If you keep pressing this, you'll only make things harder for Claire." There it was again, the polished threat dressed up as concern. Ethan shifted the invoice in his hand and held it under the prep lamp. The crooked timestamp caught the light. The signature at the bottom, tilted the wrong way, sat there like a mistake that had been copied too fast. "Then why was the camera marked serviced after the ring was already gone?" he asked. No one answered immediately. In the pause, the old phone buzzed a third time, and Claire flinched so hard the apron slipped from one shoulder. Ethan noticed a tiny line of dust along the phone's cracked edge, the same pale residue he had seen on the file room shelf just behind the service door. Not enough to prove anything on its own. Enough to make him look harder. He held out his hand, not to take the phone away, but to ask permission. Claire hesitated, then gave him the phone as if she were handing over something fragile and very old. The screen was lit now. One missed call. Unknown number. A voicemail icon. One of the kitchen staff muttered, "Probably nothing." But Ethan had already learned that in rooms like this, probably nothing was often where the truth hid. He tapped the voicemail and brought the speaker close, low enough that only the people nearest the counter could hear. At first there was only static, then the faint hum of refrigeration, a click, and the kind of background noise that belonged to a hallway, not a sink. A woman's voice entered the recording, thin with strain but unmistakably controlled, saying only a few words before the line warped. "If they ask, don't let them." Then a sharp sound cut her off, like a door closing or a cart hitting a wall. The manager moved immediately. "Enough," he said, reaching across the counter with a quickness he had not shown a second ago. Ethan lifted the phone just out of reach. Not high, just enough. The move was so small it almost looked accidental, but the room felt it. Claire did too. Her eyes widened a little, and for the first time she looked from the phone to the manager instead of down at the floor. That was the proof of character the room had been waiting for. Ethan didn't use the recording to humiliate anyone. He didn't replay it loudly. He didn't weaponize it. He simply asked, "Why does this sound like the file room, not the sink?" The chef's expression changed first. Not fully, just enough to show a crack in the smile. The assistant turned her head toward the manager, and Ethan saw the tiny, dangerous thing a person does when they realize someone else in the room knows the shape of the lie. The manager tried to answer with procedure. "We're handling a staff matter." Ethan pointed once at the invoice, once at the phone. "This camera was serviced after it went dark. This voicemail came from somewhere else in the building." And Claire's phone has dust from the file room on it. He didn't say it like a triumph. He said it like a man laying 3 boards across a gap and waiting to see who would fall through. The manager's hand finally touched the counter, and Ethan saw it. Not just tension, but the reflex of someone about to hide the paper, hide the phone, hide the gap. He slid the maintenance receipt toward himself, but Ethan put 2 fingers on the edge first and kept it in place. That was all. No drama. No schab. Just a quiet refusal to let the story be moved again. Claire stood a little straighter. She had not spoken more than a few words the entire time, but the voicemail seemed to have loosened something in her chest. "I heard that voice before," she said, so softly it barely reached the counter. The manager's eyes darted to her, then away. Too fast. Too careful. Ethan saw the reaction and knew the clue had opened more than a crack. It had opened a hallway. The recording wasn't the answer. It was a door to whoever had been in that file room, whoever had called from the unknown number, whoever had decided a dead camera and a tilted signature would be enough to bury the rest. And as the old phone gave one last weak buzz in Ethan's hand, he understood that the first proof had already changed the room. Because somebody inside it was no longer sure the story belonged to them. The voicemail had gone quiet, but its weight stayed on the counter between Ethan Reed and the manager like something alive. Claire Hart's cracked old phone still glowed in Ethan's hand, the last frame on the screen frozen on an unknown number and a half-deleted message that sounded too much like a warning to be random. Ethan didn't play it again. He didn't need to. The room had already heard enough to understand that the phone had not been sitting in Claire's pocket by accident. It had been carried through the building, past the sink, past the prep line, and into a place where somebody expected it to disappear. The manager reached for the phone, but Ethan slid it back toward Claire instead. Not as a challenge, just as a quiet refusal to let her be disarmed. "Who called you?" he asked her, still low, still careful. Claire looked from the phone to the service door, then toward the shadowed hall that led to the office corridor. Her mouth parted once, closed again, and for a second the whole kitchen seemed to hold its breath around that tiny hesitation. "I don't know their name," she said finally, and the answer was so soft it almost dissolved into the hum of the vents. "But I know that voice." Ethan held still, not because he was unsure, but because he could feel the room tipping toward something heavier. The manager's expression stayed polished, but the skin at his temple had begun to shine. He touched his tie, then dropped his hand, then touched the edge of the prep table as if he needed something solid to remind him where he stood. Claire swallowed and added, "It was in the file room." That sentence changed the air. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the assistant to stop pretending she was organizing menus and for the chef to look toward the office corridor like he had suddenly remembered there were other witnesses in the building. Ethan turned back to the maintenance invoice and compared it to the voicemail timestamp. The call had come in at 8:13. The camera maintenance request had been signed at 8:09. The camera above the sink had gone dark at 8:11. The gaps were too neat to be an accident, too close to one another to be careless. He laid the invoice flat beneath the fluorescent strip, and the crooked signature looked even more wrong under the light, as if someone had signed it after copying the shape of their own name from memory. "This isn't just one mistake," Ethan said. "It's a pattern." The manager gave a thin, contained laugh, but it came out too fast. "You're making leaps." His voice was still professional, but something had shifted under it, a small crack of irritation that hadn't been there before. He tried to take control by narrowing the room. "Claire is upset. You're encouraging confusion. That phone could have come from anywhere." He said it like a sentence in court, but it landed like panic in a hallway. Ethan noticed the way he said could have. He noticed the way the manager's gaze kept flicking to the office door. More than once. Too often. Claire shifted a half step closer to Ethan, and that movement told him more than the manager's words had. She was not only afraid of being blamed, she was afraid of being recognized. Ethan asked her one careful question, the kind that only opens if the truth is already near the surface. "When you heard that voice, did it sound like someone who knew your name before tonight?" Claire looked down at the ring again. The engraved crest glinted under the prep lamp, and the blue ink trapped in its groove seemed darker now, almost like dye from an official file stamp. She nodded once. That was all. But it was enough to make Ethan look at the ring differently. Not as jewelry. Not as evidence of theft. As something that had passed through paperwork, through hands, through a system that knew exactly what it was hiding. He lifted the ring with the napkin and turned toward the office corridor. The manager stepped in front of him immediately, smiling again, but the smile was too narrow to be real. "We are not leaving the floor," he said. "If you want to discuss personal matters, we can do it privately after service." There it was. The first attempt to move the whole truth behind a closed door. Ethan didn't move around him. He simply said, "No. We're doing it where the camera should have been working." The assistant's eyes flicked toward the dead unit above the sink. Then, almost unconsciously, she checked the office corridor as well. Ethan saw that glance, and in that glance he saw the shape of the system. This was not one corrupted moment. It was a chain, a dead camera, a changed log, a missing minute, a phone that should not have been in Claire's pocket, a voicemail from the file room, and now the manager, who had begun to forget the precise order of his own lies. Ethan stepped to the side and pulled the maintenance invoice from the counter again, this time noticing a second detail. The paper itself had a faint crease where it had been folded into a different envelope before it reached the kitchen. He touched the fold and realized it had been tucked inside a file folder at some point, not handed over fresh. The manager saw him notice. His face tightened for a fraction of a second, then smoothed over. "You're reading too much into this," he said. But his hand moved to his pocket, and that tiny, nervous motion was all the confirmation Ethan needed. Claire heard it too. Her eyes lifted. "My mother used to keep copies of everything," she said before she could stop herself. The words were small, but they didn't belong to the room as it had been pretending to exist. They belonged to somewhere older, somewhere more private. The assistant went still. The chef looked at Claire with a new kind of caution. Ethan did not press her. He only asked, "Mother?" Claire nodded once, and for the first time her voice gained a little shape. "She worked in an office like this. She said never trust the first paper if there are two copies." The manager's face changed when she said it. Not much. Just enough to show he had expected a different kind of silence from her. Ethan felt the room go colder around that detail. Another copy. Another hidden version. Another place where the truth had been trimmed before anyone else saw it. That was the larger truth beginning to stand up in the room. This was not simply a stolen ring or a frightened dishwasher. This was a family story being edited by people who had gotten used to editing stories. The sound of the printer from the office suddenly stopped, and in the new silence Ethan could hear the refrigerator motor, the faint click of a knife against a cutting board, and Claire's breathing trying to steady itself. Then the office door opened a few inches, and a strip of bright hall light cut across the floor, making the ring in Ethan's napkin flash once like a signal. The manager turned too quickly toward it, and Ethan saw his mistake before he could hide it. He knew what was in that office. Not just files. Not just records. Something linked to Claire. Something he had planned to keep out of sight until the dinner rush ended. Ethan slid the napkin into his palm, placed the invoice on top of it, and said the one thing that could no longer be delayed. "We're not solving this in private anymore." By the time the dinner rush thinned, the restaurant felt less like a room and more like a stage waiting for the next line. The guests had been asked to stay seated. The lights over the main dining room were still warm, but the energy had changed. Forks rested against plates. Conversations had dropped into whispers. Ethan Reed stood near the front of the room with the folded napkin in one hand and the maintenance invoice in the other, both of them small pieces of paper that suddenly seemed heavier than anything expensive in the building. Claire Hart stood a few steps behind him, still in the spare apron Ethan had draped over her shoulders earlier, her fingers locked together so tightly that her knuckles looked pale under the light. The manager had arranged himself near the host's stand with the chef and assistant slightly behind him, all of them wearing the same calm expression people use when they want to look reasonable while hiding something rotten. The room watched them all. Nobody moved too fast. Nobody raised their voice. That made it worse. I'd like everyone to remain calm, the manager said, his tone polished enough to sound helpful. We are dealing with a staff issue that has been misunderstood. A piece of property was misplaced. Emotions ran high. Mr. Reed stepped in without authorization, and now we are here. He said it like a man reading from a script he trusted. He even opened his hands toward the guests as if to apologize on behalf of everyone else. A few people nodded without meaning to. A woman at the center table lowered her eyes to her bread plate, already deciding that perhaps this was exactly the sort of thing diners should not witness. Ethan did not interrupt. He simply reached into his apron pocket and set the napkin on the nearest table. Then he laid the ring out in the center under the chandelier light. The tiny engraved crest caught the glow and threw it back at the room like a signal no one could ignore. Claire inhaled sharply behind him. The manager's smile stayed on, but the color beneath it shifted. That ring, Ethan said, his voice low and level, was on the prep counter before anyone called Claire's name. The manager gave a brief, professional laugh. And now it is secured, which is exactly what should have happened from the start. He turned to the guests again, making sure they saw the posture of a man trying to keep order. There was no theft. There was confusion. The matter has been handled internally. That was the first defense. Clean, sensible, almost boring. It might have worked if Ethan had not already brought the invoice with him. He placed it beside the ring, flattened it with 2 fingers, and pointed to the timestamp. This says the camera above the sink was serviced after it went dark, he said. Not before. After. The dining room went quiet enough that the ice in a water glass seemed loud when it settled. The manager's assistant looked down at the receipt. The chef stared at it as though paper itself had become offensive. The manager kept his face smooth. Maintenance paperwork gets filed late all the time, he said. That is not evidence of anything except a busy restaurant. Ethan looked at him without blinking. Then why does your signature on the work order tilt the wrong direction? A small murmur moved across the tables. It was not enough to break the room open, but it was enough to make people lean in. The manager's jaw shifted once. He turned slightly, just enough to block the guest's view of the office corridor. That was the first crack. Not a collapse. A crack. You're comparing penmanship now? He asked, still gentle, still trying to sound amused. Ethan nodded once. I'm comparing the story you told to the paper you signed. Claire took a slow breath. Her eyes had moved from the ring to the receipt and then to the dead camera near the sink. The same one everyone had been pretending not to notice. The assistant reached for a stack of menus, then stopped halfway and pulled her hand back. The silence in the room had changed shape. It no longer belonged to the manager. It belonged to the evidence. Then Ethan set the old phone on the table beside the ring. The cracked screen was lit with the same unknown number from before, and the room seemed to lean toward it without meaning to. The manager's face barely changed, but Ethan saw his eyes flick to the phone and stay there a fraction too long. This phone was in Claire's apron pocket, Ethan said. The voicemail on it sounds like the file room. A few guests shifted in their seats. One man folded, his hands more tightly. Claire looked as if she wished the floor would open and swallow her, but she did not step away. She stayed where Ethan had placed her, close enough to be protected, far enough to be seen. The manager recovered quickly. That was what made him dangerous. He could put a new face on a lie as fast as most people could inhale. An old phone with a broken speaker proves nothing, he said. It could have belonged to anyone. We have staff property all the time. He took one step closer to the table, angling his body in a way that almost, but not quite, blocked the guests from seeing the screen. A small retention spike ran through the room then, because for a moment it sounded like he might actually be right. He was calm. He was professional. He was saying the words of a man with procedures on his side. And then Claire spoke. It was quiet, barely there, but it cut through the room cleaner than anything else had. That voice knew my name before tonight. Every head turned toward her. Even the chef stopped pretending to look anywhere else. The manager's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Claire in a way that was not anger exactly. It was recognition mixed with caution. Ethan saw it immediately. Not enough to name it yet, but enough to know the room had changed again. Claire reached into the front pocket of her apron with one shaking hand and pulled out the old phone herself. On the back of the case, hidden under the cracked edge, there was a strip of faded white tape with a handwritten number on it. The manager's assistant made a tiny, involuntary sound when she saw it. Ethan did not speak. He only looked at the tape, then at the assistant, then at the manager. The number on the tape matched the one on the maintenance folder Ethan had seen folded into the invoice earlier. The pattern had become a shape now. The manager's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's office tagging," he said too quickly. "Every department uses similar labels." But the explanation sounded thinner in the room than it had in his own head. Across the dining room, the hotel-style printer near the host stand suddenly clicked and spat out a single page of paper. Nobody had touched it. The machine had come alive on its own, and the sound of it made the entire room stop. The assistant went pale. The chef turned his head toward the printer so fast that Ethan knew, before he knew why, that this was the moment the next layer would fall. Claire looked toward the printer too, and Ethan saw that she had recognized the sound or the place or the way the paper had come out with that same office code printed at the top. The manager moved first, too quickly, reaching toward the printer in a reflex that was almost panic. Ethan stepped in front of him, not aggressively, just enough to stop him. The guests were watching now fully. No one was sipping wine. No one was pretending not to listen. The ring, the receipt, the phone, the tape, the fresh printout, all of it sat in a line across the table like a trail leading into a door that had finally been found. Ethan kept his voice calm enough to keep the room from breaking apart. "Whatever is on that page," he said, "belongs in front of everyone now." And as the manager's hand hovered over the printer, the first sheet slid into view with a name at the top that made Claire go still, and made the man in charge lose the last of his smile. The printer finished its whisper with a soft mechanical cough, and the single page sliding into the tray looked harmless until Ethan Reed lifted it and the top line caught the light. Claire Hart. Underneath her name, in a smaller line of office type, was a hospital tag number Ethan had already seen in the old phone message thread and the faded tape on the case. The room did not explode. It went still. The kind of still that comes only when people realize the paper in front of them is not an opinion, not a rumor, but a key. Claire made a tiny sound in her throat and took one step forward, then stopped when the owner of the restaurant emerged from the office corridor with a sealed envelope in his hand and a look on his face Ethan had not seen there before. Not authority, not anger, but the weight of something buried too long. The manager turned toward him at once. "Mr. Wainwright, this has been contained." His voice had lost its polish. The owner did not answer him. He only looked at the page in Ethan's hand, then at Claire, and the room seemed to narrow around the line of his gaze. "Open it," he said, not to the manager, but to himself, and then he broke the seal on the envelope with fingers that shook once before he could hide it. Inside was a hospital tag, a birth record copy, and a folded note on cream paper so old the edges had softened with time. Ethan saw the tag first. Same number, same ink, same little tear at one corner. The owner's breath hitched. He stared at the tag, then at Claire's face, and for a second he looked less like a man in charge of a business and more like a father standing at the end of a hallway he had searched all his life to find. "That tag," he said quietly, "was from my daughter." Nobody moved. Even the clink from the kitchen stopped. The chef's hand froze over the back of a chair. The assistant's mouth parted and never formed a word. The manager tried to speak first because men like him always try to cover the truth the moment it starts to breathe. "This is not the time for—" "It's exactly the time," the owner said, and his voice, though soft, cut the room clean in half. He unfolded the note. Ethan could not read all of it from where he stood, but the owner's eyes moved across the page with a speed that did not belong to a first reading. It belonged to recognition. Then the owner closed his eyes briefly, as if the paper had hit him somewhere inside. When he opened them, he turned the note toward Claire instead of away from her. "Your mother wrote this," he said. Claire's hand flew to her mouth. The old phone in Ethan's palm vibrated once, then went still. The screen glowed with the same contact name that had been half lost in the voicemail thread, now made plain by the note's letterhead. A storage code, family file, a hidden archive. The manager took a small, unconscious step backward. Ethan saw the exact moment the room slipped out of his hands. Not because anyone shouted, because the owner looked directly at him and asked, "Why was my daughter in the sink room with a false staff badge and a dead camera above her?" The question landed harder than anger could have. The manager opened his mouth, but what came out was a dry, useless sound. He reached for the paper, then stopped himself when he realized everyone was watching his hand. That was the difference now. Earlier, he had controlled the room by using procedures, smiles, and quiet pressure. Now every gesture had become evidence. Claire stood very still. Ethan could see her throat working around words that would not come. The owner took one step closer to her, careful, almost afraid of what sudden movement might do to the moment. "Claire," he said, and his voice changed on her name, breaking on the edge of it. "Your mother kept this for you." He held out the birth record. The printed name on it matched the one on the page from the printer. The date matched the hospital tag. The file number matched the voicemail tape on the phone. All the separate pieces Ethan had been carrying in his mind had finally clicked together with the quiet sound of a lock opening. Claire's knees seemed to lose strength for a second, and Ethan reached out just enough to steady her elbow, not to hold her up like she was fragile, but to keep her from collapsing under the weight of being seen. She looked at the birth record as if she had not earned the right to touch it. "I was told it was gone," she whispered. The owner's face tightened. "Someone kept it from me." There was no rage in his voice yet, only the terrible calm of a man realizing the loss was not an accident. He turned to the manager, and now the silence in the room had teeth. "Who had access to the archive?" he asked. The manager's confidence had thinned to nearly nothing. He glanced at the assistant, then to the chef, then to the guests, looking for a face that might save him from the floor he was standing on. None did. One woman at the center table had set her fork down and forgotten it. A man near the window leaned forward with both hands on the table, his eyes fixed on the birth record. Nobody was filming anymore. They were listening. That was the silence payoff in its purest form. The room had stopped being an audience and become a witness. The manager finally found a sentence and said it with a dryness that almost cracked in his throat. "We followed staff retention policy." The owner looked at him as if hearing the words for the first time. "You kept my child's record under policy?" No one laughed. No one breathed loud enough to matter. The assistant's eyes filled with a sharp, guilty shine, but she did not speak. The chef's shoulders sank just a fraction. Ethan looked down at Claire and saw something change in her face that had nothing to do with the paper and everything to do with the name being returned to her in front of strangers. She was still frightened, still wounded, but no longer invisible. The owner held the sealed envelope open in one hand and the birth record in the other, as if he had finally reached the edge of the truth and did not know whether to grieve or kneel. "I need to know," he said, and now his voice was meant for everyone in the room. "Who moved her out of my file, who changed the camera log, and who told this girl to wear a false badge and stay silent?" The manager's answer did not come. Could not. The evidence had become too orderly, too complete, too quiet. The birth record, the tag, the voicemail, the ring, the invoice, the fake maintenance note, all of it had arrived at the same table and pointed in one direction. Claire's hand slipped from her mouth and found Ethan's sleeve instead, clinging there only for a second before she remembered how to stand on her own. The owner saw it. He saw Ethan, too, and the look he gave him was not gratitude alone. It was recognition of a man who had protected someone before knowing why she mattered. Then the owner turned back to the birth record, and the whole room felt the next decision gathering in the air like thunder. Because the truth had finally been named, but now someone had to decide what would happen to the man who hid it, and whether Ethan Reed would remain just a waiter in a stained apron, or become the one person this family trusted to stand beside them when the doors finally opened wide.